Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive, Emerald City Hockey Seattle Kraken podcast. How you feeling, RJ? Doing better?
Yeah, doing much better. Glad to be back on the podcast after I hated to miss a post-game live, but definitely for the best given how my voice was. But happy to be back.
Yeah, definitely glad to have you back. Got it. I was gonna say an exciting podcast today, but I'm sure everybody already saw the title. It's gonna be an uncomfortable conversation to have regarding thoughts on, the Kraken doing a full rebuild and what that may or may not mean for the team, and not just on the ice, but for everything that exists around the Seattle Kraken. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Of course, got some, pre-trade deadline news and notes to go over, which we will absolutely spend some time on. But of course, got to start off thanking our wonderful sponsor, Queen Anne Beer Hall, for sponsoring this podcast like they have done all season long. Really excited to have them on board. And RJ, it's a new month, which means there's a new burger of the month over at the Queen Anne Beer Hall locations. This month, it's a Korean barbecue burger. So see if people want to go check that out. You gonna check it out?
Yes, I am. I mean, they get so creative with these burgers, right? These burger of the month. I mean, listen to this. Bulgogi marinated smash burger with white cheddar, bacon, crisped green onion curls, sliced pears, Korean pepper mayo, and sesame aioli. Doesn't that sound good? Also, go check out their Instagram, by the way, Queen Anne Beer Hall. They have a picture of it. It looks delicious.
I'll take your word for it. As the picky eater who doesn't like basically anything that you just listed.
That's a bit too much for you.
It's a little bit too much, but that's just because I don't like food. So everybody has seen my plates of dry bread, rice, and pasta with nothing on it. So don't listen to me. And then just want to throw out there that over on Patreon at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, on Sunday the 10th at 7 p.m., RJ will be having his post-trade deadline armchair GM stream. So no matter what the Kraken end up doing, that's going to be the number one place where we'll be talking about it, the future outlooks, what it means salary cap-wise, what it means future-wise for roster construction, all that good stuff. Can't wait for you to have that, RJ. And just see what happens, really. I mean, as we can kind of transition right into the news and notes here, I'm just really intrigued to see what happens come trade deadline, because I think we got to start off with this, RJ. After kind of scoreboard watching things yesterday, are the Kraken done? Because I think right now, I think they're probably done, as they sit 9 points back out of a playoff spot. They don't really have games in hand. I mean, they've got 2 on Nashville, but I don't know. This feels like a lot.
Right. It does feel like, it's at that point where the hill is just maybe too great to climb. You said they're 9 points out of a playoff spot, only 2 games to go till the deadline before they have to make a lot of these decisions. And Nashville just does not lose right now. They've got 8 wins in a row. They're on fire. And then, the Kings have kind of started to pick it back up. These last 2 games, they've looked as good as they have all season. It's going to be a really tough challenge for the Kraken. And if you look at most publicly available models, the Kraken are about 10% odds to make the playoffs. A 1 in 10 chance. It's, frankly, it's not great. So, we kind of have to be real with everybody here. That's the mindset that we have as we're going into this trade deadline talk, where I think the playoffs are unlikely this season.
Yeah, and far cry from like last time we were talking, right? Where it was 20%, maybe, Calgary was looking at trading away guys. They did end up trading away Tanev, but somehow they keep winning. We were hoping that maybe you could get up to even 25% for the Kraken not that long ago. And now here we are down at about 10%. And that feels accurate, just because Nashville, like you said, did not, start losing. Like they can't stop winning. Calgary's been able to continue to win. St. Louis, Minnesota. I mean, things have just not gone well for the Kraken on the out of town scoreboard. And then even with the team, they've started to turn things around. They're playing better. I think they went back to that kind of more boring style of shut it down, try to grind out games, win 2-1. Worked great in that Pittsburgh game. I think it worked pretty well against Edmonton, but you do end up losing that game. And I just think that might have been, the final straw, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean that's the reality though. It's there's no room for error when you dig the kind of hole that the Kraken dug earlier this season, and they've been playing well. I think they figured out a lot of things about their game. They figured out that blueprint to kind of playing solid defensively, trying to beat teams that way. But sometimes you have a game like that one against Edmonton where it's just you're against a better team, you can't pull off the upset, and unfortunately, that there's just no room for error.
Yeah, so that's where the Kraken are at. I know based on post game lives and seeing the talk over on the Discord and on Twitter and stuff, I think a lot of people are kind of coming to the same conclusion. Unfortunately, I mean, obviously we didn't want that to happen. We thought, if they can get in there, and there's still a chance that they could sneak in there, but you never know once you're in the playoffs. We saw that, of course, last year with them. I thought this year they were still pretty built for the playoffs. If they could get in there, they could maybe make something happen. But with the trade deadline 2 games away, down 9 points, that's really tough. And again, not going to have tiebreakers, because that's the other aspect. I maybe wouldn't be so pessimistic about it if they were in a position to have tiebreakers, but with no tiebreakers, this many teams still in it, nobody falling out, and that gap, that's just it feels like one thing too many.
Right. It's basically as good as 10 points, which is 5 games with about 20 games to go.
Yeah,
That's a big gap to make up.
it's a big gap. So with the deadline approaching, RJ, with the Kraken in the spot where they are in right now, which is not looking great, what are we thinking? What are we hearing come, trade deadline talks with the Kraken here?
Right. And I mean, we're hearing a lot, and that's, of course, what happens this time of year. You have especially Elliot Friedman. We've heard the most from him, especially this morning, where he did a written 32 Thoughts and then a 32 Thoughts podcast where he went through every single team in the league and kind of went over what he's hearing in respect to their players at the trade deadline. And so with the Kraken, I mean, there are a few different notes, a lot of players covered actually that he talked about, but he says the number one thing that he's hearing from the Kraken is that other teams want their defensemen. They love their defense. They Adam Larson, Jamie Alexiak, Will Borgen. Those guys are really coveted around the league. But he hears that the Kraken are telling other teams, no, they're not going to do that. They're not willing to move Larson, Alexiak, Borgen. They do not want to move a top 4 defense, but also, Dunn in there as well. I think teams know they're not going to move him. Mm-hmm. But yeah, basically teams want their top defenseman. Kraken are saying no. And the other thing they're saying no to is Yanni Gourde. Seems like a lot of interest around the league there, but they don't want to move him. So we'll start with those guys, Dylan. Start with the D, I guess. Larson, Alexiak, Borgen. Do you have an issue with Ron Francis wanting to hold on to those guys, or do you think it makes sense?
I think it makes sense. I mean, look, if you were to move on from those guys and say that they are available, you're saying that, yes, this team is going to enter a longer-term rebuild, right? You're giving up not just this year, but all of these guys are under contract for next season. You're saying you're giving up next year too, right? Because it's not like in the pipeline you have somebody to replace these guys. And you would be paying more for a replacement in free agency. I mean, all of them are on good contracts. They're very, very healthy contracts. They are going to age well next year when the cap jumps even more, right? Like Larson at $4 million next year. You're not going to get a guy who's going to be playing with Vince Dunn 25 minutes a night at $4 million. You know what I mean? Like, that's just not going to happen. So I think this is a very, very clear signal from Ron Francis that the Kraken are still in it next year. They do not want to enter a longer rebuild. We'll talk about that, of course, a little bit later on in the podcast, but that is what this signals to me, is that if guys have term beyond this year, Kraken want to keep them.
Right. You hit the nail on the head. This signals Francis's intention to at least try and go for it next year. Because trading one of these guys, you're right, that would be kind of throwing in the towel on this year and possibly next year as well. So they're not going to do that, it seems like. So moving on to guys that are maybe a little bit more likely to be moved or that aren't on expiring contracts. We'll start with Jordan Eberle, because I think there's been most of the talk around him. Friedman says the Kraken seem prepared to keep Eberle even if an extension is not done by the trade deadline. So that kind of matches what's been out there for a little while now. I think the Kraken probably want to bring him back, judging by all the talk there. We know he wants to come back. We know the interest is there on Eberle's side. Now, there was an interesting comment from Friedman on the podcast. He did say, he talked about the Eberle's 1,000th game, which is coming up if he plays all the remaining games and stays with the Kraken. It would be that home game against Vegas. He's very close. So, but he did mention that that is something that they're thinking about or considering a little bit, and that they really would like him to be a Kraken for his 1,000th game. Now, he said it's not the biggest thing, but it is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, just kind of some circumstantial, factor. But Dylan, does that, what do you think about that? Maybe taking that into account, the 1,000th game thing, because, and, maybe there's not a whole lot to it, but I don't think that's something you should be considering at all when looking at trading a player or not.
It's one of those classic things of what is best for the on ice product long term versus what is best for the entertainment product. Right. Like this is one of those classic general manager versus, say, ownership type ideas where it's, yes, if you can get an asset for Jordan Eberle on an expiring contract, everything says you should. Right. Like that is the appropriate course of action if you're a general manager, because it's all about just building up assets, getting as much as you can for a guy that you might be losing or you could maybe bring back in the offseason or whatever. The point is, you're not a playoff team. You should be moving all of those guys on expiring contracts out the door. But on the flip side of things, you need to have an excited fan base. You need to have a fan base that wants to show up to games down the stretch when you aren't going to make the playoffs. You need a fan base that wants and feels like some of their star players or the fan favorite players have security with the franchise so they can go out and spend $300 on a jersey for them and celebrate in those moments with them and feel like that player really, cares about the city that they live in and the city that they're playing in and the fans around them there. And so there's a lot of benefits to it from a, fan base entertainment standpoint, but I understand where you're coming from the kind of cold, heartless world of just strict general managing. I'm with you. I understand that. And again, this will be part of the conversation later, but I do feel like for a young franchise like the Kraken, especially after a year like this where there hasn't been too much to cheer about and really be excited about, I understand, and I do think that would be something worth considering.
Right. And in the bigger picture, when you're talking about re-signing him too, I like Jordan Eberle. I like that he's part of the team. I like that he wants to stay here in Seattle. I like that he's embraced the city and, he's bringing up a family here. But just on the ice, it makes no sense to me. I just, unless he takes a gigantic hometown discount, which maybe he will. I don't know. He seems to really like it here. He's, maybe toward the tail end of his career. We don't know that he won't.
Yeah.
But unless he does that, it just doesn't make sense.
I was going to say, and Ron's gotten other guys to do that, right? Like it's important to remember, like with the Jared McCann deal or the Vince Dunn deal. I mean, we'll see with the Matty Beniers deal. That's probably going to be our biggest test of this. We've seen every time somebody has kind of come up for an extension since the Kraken have started playing games, the contracts come in a lot lower than we thought. Even Berkey, right? Like as a free agent, as one of the top free agents that year, the Kraken go out, they get, what was one of the big fish in that market. We had thought his contract was probably going to maybe be a little higher than 5.5. So I think there is room for an Eberle deal if for whatever that extension looks like to potentially be a lower number than maybe you and I would think of normally. Now, maybe it might be a higher number than now just because the cap is going up so much. So, but percentage of the cap wise, I could see it maybe not being as, quote unquote bad as we think it could be.
Right. And I think it'd be less than what the models are projecting just because of those, intangible things that they don't take into account, like family and how much he wants to stay. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it'll be less than what the models say. I can't imagine it's low enough. The number is low enough to actually make sense, though, from a cap management, asset management perspective. I mean, Dylan, what's the number that you think it would make sense at? Or I mean, I can go.
Yeah, first. No, yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to think because he's still like a 20 goal guy. He's a good guy to have around. He could play on.
I mean, the term also
wing.
matters, of course.
I think term. I'm not going longer than 2 years, right? But I would say that for anybody that age, at forward, and 4.5. I think like you could survive that, especially with the cap going up.
4 is 2 years. I wouldn't go above that, and then 4 is the absolute max that I think would make sense. With the cap going up, I guess, but just you look at the opportunity cost, other things you could do with that money, what you could put it towards. And I know there's not
what
stars
other things.
Available.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, what other things though? We've talked about this.
Well, I mean, maybe even like a Bjorkstrand type trade. If there's a team that's cap strapped, where you could get somebody who's maybe not a star, but a little bit more dynamic. And I think there's always value in having that cap space. But, and especially too on the second year, gosh, if it's a 3-year deal, that's where you really get into trouble, where you're on the third year of that deal and it doesn't make any sense. But, yeah, I guess 4 million is the most I would go. And maybe he does take that. I just don't know that it's going to be that little.
Yeah, I mean, we'll end up finding out. Based on how aggressive everything has sounded about him staying in Seattle. I think there's a chance that he would take something like that, just because. And like I said earlier, everybody else seems to. Like, everybody, once they play there, they seem to really like it. I mean, Jared McCann left way more money than that on the table, right? When he signed his extension year one. You look at, like I said, the Berkey deal, the Vince Dunn deal. I mean, that deal came in way lower than we thought it would. So I think that's a real possibility here. I mean, guys like this franchise, they like the city, and Ron Francis, gets them to take less money because of it. Like, this is the track record.
Yeah, we'll see what kind of magic he can work. So I'll reserve some judgment until an extension is actually out there. But we'll see what it ends up being.
Yeah. Okay, so that's that. Yeah.
Yep. So on to the next player, and that's Alex Wenberg. So not hearing a ton on that from Friedman. He just kind of remarked, it could go either way. Basically, that's what he's hearing as far as trading him or keeping him. Could go either way. So Dylan, I mean, do you have thoughts on which way they should go with Wenberg? It sounds like there's not as much interest right away, in re-signing him as there is in Eberle.
Mm-hmm.
Also, of course, you've got Shane Wright coming up next season to think about, where that's one where it just feels like that spot is going to go to Shane Wright, and there's not going to really be a place for Alex Wenberg next season. But I think more than any other move you could make here of the UFAs, this one would be throwing in the towel on this season. I don't know how you possibly climb back into the playoff rate and get into a wild card spot if you get rid of Alex Wenberg. He's just playing so much of a role for this team, and you can't bring up Shane Wright to replace him right now without burning the ELC, and they're not going to do that. So I think this is the one that basically throws in the towel on this year. And do you think they're going to do that? Would you do it?
I think Ron Francis will do it if he gets what he feels is appropriate value. I think, again, 1 year, the last year deals, like I said, I think they're kind of out of it. I think anybody on an expiring contract should be fair game. That's just the way it is. Like, I think that I'm on board with. Unlike Eberle, who has very much expressed his desire to stay longer term, and you have the 1,000th game and all of that stuff that I think complicates the Eberle situation, doesn't really exist with Alexander Wenberg. I have to assume he would want to go and test free agency, just because as a center, proven two-way guy, a guy who would be valuable on a cup contending team, not just this year, but in the future. I got to imagine he could go out there and get a pretty good deal if he had all 32 teams bidding on him instead of just trying to work out an extension with one. And then obviously the Shane Wright situation we've talked about before, and that really means that there's just not enough room to have him here. So I think, yes, if somebody's willing to give up what Ron Francis wants, he'll make the move. Center market got going early. The big center trades kind of already happened. You have to just, I guess, at this point wonder, RJ, is there a team that's not on his no trade list that still needs a center bad enough that maybe they would, look at maybe a first if you could for Wenberg? I think that would be great, or even a second. That's just going to be the question.
Right, and that's my original asking price if I'm Ron Francis, a first-round pick or equivalent value. First, maybe a second and a third if a team would rather do that. But that's kind of the price I'm asking teams to meet. And if they don't do it, then I don't necessarily mind hanging on to the player. If they're trying to lowball you on a player like Wenberg, because look, he's one of the more underrated players in the league. And I think, smart hockey people, GMs who pay attention, I would hope realize what he could do for a playoff team as a 3C. But, if there isn't that recognition and they're, offering just a third round pick or something, hang on to him. Why not? It's also part of the GM brinksmanship, right? Where Brian Burke is famous for talking about this, right? Where he'll set prices for players and he'd rather lose a guy for nothing than show that he's the type of guy who's going to cave. Because long-term, you're a repeat player in this game. You have to make sure that people know that you're serious when you set a price. But for Wenberg, I certainly would be open to moving him. And yeah, you're right. He does have a 10-team no trade list. So that could factor in as well, but I don't think it should be too much of an obstacle to a deal.
No, probably not.
Yeah. So on to a couple other pending UFAs, and that is Tomas Tatar and Justin Schultz. And Friedman just kind of mentioned them briefly, basically just saying, yeah, well, yeah, it would make sense if they're moved. They're pending UFAs and they're not, essential kind of guys. So we'll start with Tatar. So the Kraken brought him in earlier this season. I think gave up a 5th-round pick for him. Would you be open to flipping Tomas Tatar if a team offered? Obviously, you'd be looking at an improvement on that return. You wouldn't do it just for a 5th coming back the other way. But do you think they could get better than that? And would you flip him?
You could maybe get better than that. Maybe like a 4th. You think you could get a 3rd for Tatar? Like,
I don't think so. No. It'd have to be some Francis wizardry.
Yeah, if somebody wants him, might as well let him go and potentially get a crack at the playoffs somewhere, right? He's on your 4th line here. That tells you everything you need to know, right? Like, yeah, you got to be open to moving the expiring deal on your 4th line.
Yeah. And I think with Tatar and Schultz, those are the 2 players where I don't think it's even necessarily a downgrade.
No.
If you get rid of those guys. And given the position that they're in, we just spent a long time talking about it, that maybe they're done. They're 9 points out of a playoff spot. These are the guys that you can't get cute about. You have to move them if there's a good offer there. I think Tatar, if a team's offering a 4th-round pick or better, you have to take it. And then Justin Schultz. We've talked about Riker Evans and kind of the situation there where he hasn't played games recently. And Justin Schultz has kind of been the guy in the way of that. Now, Schultz has played really well. He and Dumont have been a fantastic D pair. But I think he's the kind of luxury that you can't really afford if you're in this situation. As far as a price, Dylan, we've kind of wavered between 2nd and 3rd round pick. Would you hold out for a 2nd and then keep him if you don't get it, or would you take a 3rd?
No, I would go ahead and take a 3rd because again, he's blocking Riker Evans. That's the problem here. That I feel like is enough to force your hand. Go ahead and take a lesser asset for him just because Riker Evans needs to be playing NHL minutes. And we've talked about this. I'm okay with Riker Evans sitting on the bench for now through the deadline. But that's it. Like after that, Riker Evans should be playing whether the Kraken are in or out, because as good as Dumoulin Schultz has been, Dumoulin Evans has actually been better. And so there's no reason to keep Justin Schultz in the lineup past the trade deadline. It made sense up till now because you're trying to showcase him. Scouts are in the building. You want them to see him, all of that kind of stuff. You don't want to be trying to trade an asset that you're scratching. It's not great for leverage in negotiations. But I just think having Justin Schultz around, if you keep him past the deadline, he's probably just going to end up being a healthy scratch for you anyway. You might as well take a 3rd. It's not a bad asset to get back.
Yeah, no, that's fine getting a 3rd back for Schultz. He is at the top of my must-trade list for this trade deadline. I think you absolutely have to move Justin Schultz if you get any kind of reasonable offer, which I imagine they would get. I think he would be in demand, and there are some teams that would be interested for sure. Now, a couple more players to talk about, and these are ones that I didn't necessarily think we'd be talking about, but Friedman did mention them, so I think it's certainly important to mention them here. And the first one is the biggest surprise. And that's Brian Dumoulin. So Friedman said that he's heard Dumoulin's name come up, and he said only because it's been a hard transition for him coming to Seattle. Now, he didn't really clarify further on that. And so Dylan, what do you think Friedman means by that? Because I was confused. Brian Dumoulin, I think, aside from the first month of the season, he's been excellent. He's been one of the Kraken's best defensemen, of course, in that 3rd pairing role, but he's done everything you could ask of him for the role that he's playing.
Right. That is the confusing thing, and it makes me think that what he means is maybe off ice, right? Because on ice, we know, yes, it was a rough beginning of the season for him, but he made some adjustments. He's been fantastic afterwards. I don't even imagine that the 3rd pairing role would be necessarily the issue, because it sounded like back when they made that signing that was kind of the understanding. Right, between him and Ron Francis. That was very much, the reading between the lines as they were both speaking about it that you got. So the only thing I could think of is just that it would be a rough transition from having been in a different city for his whole career to now being in a second city, kids, family, whatever it is. But that's the only thing I can think of, is that it would be rough on that side of things. And that's, of course, hard to speculate on.
Right. I mean, there's just so much that we don't know if that is the case then. And, maybe a change of scenery would be for the best then if I don't think going back to Pittsburgh would really be in the cards, just given where the
No.
Penguins are at. So, I mean, because that's the only place he's really spent, in his NHL career.
Right.
So, I don't know,
And
kind of where else, maybe close to the East Coast or something.
yeah,
But
but
I mean,
that would be an off-season thing, right? Like you're not trying to force that through come deadline time, and if he is needing to kind of be in a certain region or something, you don't do that at the trade deadline. Those are off-season moves traditionally.
right, unless something, really odd kind of pops up where there's a team with a ton of interest that Dumoulin would want to go to, but I just don't see him being moved at the deadline. Again, maybe if there's something off the ice, you do it in the off season. I don't think it affects you too much long term. And he's been a
Mm-mm.
fantastic partner for Riker Evans. I'd hate to
Yeah.
to lose him in that respect. But I think overall he's someone you probably could replace if you
Yes.
needed to.
Yes. And that's also assuming that this information isn't still coming from the beginning of the year too. Right? I mean, we know with some of the West Coast teams and stuff with the national reporters, and Elliot Friedman has talked about this. He's fairly open about it. With some of the West Coast teams, the few times he gets updates is just when they do those East Coast swings and when they come to town to Toronto and whatever, and he really gets a chance to talk with them. It's been a while since the Kraken did that, right? So it's possible that some of that is still just left over from the beginning of the year, and it really still isn't that way, and it's just because Kraken are pretty far away from the center of things in Toronto, where all the people who peddle in the rumors and everything are, and so I think there's a chance that that could be the situation as well.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. That it's maybe not the most up to date information, but yeah, well, I mean, we'll see where that goes. I don't think we'll know much more on that before the deadline, but just an interesting name that popped up. I certainly wasn't expecting it.
Mm-mm.
Now, the last name to talk about, and he's someone that's kind of been in low key conversations when talking about the future. I mean, we certainly mentioned him on like the Armchair GM stream and stuff. More so talking about the off season and where you can free up cap space, but that's Brandon Tanev. So Elliot Friedman listed him as we called him a wild card. And he said he's had some low minute games lately and other teams like him. So at the deadline, I guess there's some interest in Brandon Tanev. And look, he's the type of player that teams, especially cup contenders,
Mm-hmm.
always seem to covet, right? I mean,
Yeah,
someone who's always going 110%, elite penalty killer. He could add a lot for a team's cup run. He is a playoff type player. We know this about
absolutely.
him.
Yep.
Now, the question though, he's under contract for another year at 3.5 million, so he's not a pending UFA. Complicates things. Should Ron Francis be open to moving him?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ron Francis, in general, should always be open to moving everybody, right? Like, that's the idea. But I think, unlike, say, the defenseman or Yanni Gord, I think Brandon Tanev's in a spot where he's a little bit more non-essential for next year, right? Despite having that year on his contract, where all those other people, you're not going to be able to as easily replace them. And obviously, you're never going to replace a guy like Brandon Tanev. What he brings is so unique. And the biggest fear for me would be losing him on the penalty kill. Right, we've seen the difference when he is injured and out of the lineup. How much worse the Kraken's penalty kill is without him, and the fact that look, next year you're probably not having Alexander Wenberg, another major player on your penalty kill unit. Right, so you're talking about having to replace two people there. Matty Beniers has been deserving of being on a penalty kill unit, so I think he's a natural fit to fill in for one of them. But I could also see that maybe you're looking ahead to next year and you're like, I don't know, Shane Wright's not going to be ready year one to do that. I think long term Shane Wright can play penalty kill minutes, but I don't know that year one. It'd be nice to have that Brandon Tanev cushion. But yeah, I mean, if somebody is really serious and this turns into a maybe not quite Blake Coleman or Barclay Goodrow level of going to Tampa for a first round pick because they just need that kind of guy. But if somebody's like, hey, I'll give you a second right now for Brandon Tanev, Ron Francis should probably do that.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you here. I think it may be an unpopular opinion. I know how popular Brandon Tanev is with the fans, but I kind of have strong feelings about this one. If you can get a good return, even a decent return for Brandon Tanev, I think Ron Francis should absolutely do that. I mean, basically, it comes down to just the cap management and the asset management. You have a fourth liner. He is solidly a fourth liner for you,
Mm-hmm.
and you're paying him 3.5 million. I mean, that is way more than you should be paying a fourth liner in just about any circumstance. And yes, you mentioned the penalty kill. I think he is an elite penalty killer, but I mean, honestly, results wise, how much is he actually helping you there? The Kraken have the 21st ranked penalty kill in the league. I mean, how much worse would it really be without him? And I know we saw the eye test, it looked worse without him, but still, I mean, if that's what it's getting you, 21st in the league, I just think that money could be spent better elsewhere. You could bring in a player at near league minimum salary, whether it's one of your prospects coming up like a Winterton next season, or whether it's just somebody you sign as a free agent who can do maybe 80 to 90% of that job for much less of the cost. And I just think, with Tanev, especially with another year left on his contract, it just frees you up some more flexibility. Maybe it's the Eberle extension, or, bringing back someone who, like Eberle, who's a 20 goal scorer rather than a fourth liner who I think is actually quite replaceable.
Well, that's the thing, is that it's the fact that in this group he's stuck on the fourth line.
Yeah.
And that's that.
Well, I mean,
he
but look,
shouldn't be.
Given
like,
maybe, as like a third line player, but he's not a top six guy.
No, but that's what I'm
score.
saying is like, as a thing is like, he's probably in a better spot if he's in a different team. It's probably better for him if he's on a different team, because I feel like, especially come playoff time, you're gonna want him out there more. And what you're gonna bump down Eli Tolvanen for Brandon Tanev here. Like, you're not gonna do that, right? Bjorkstrand, you're not gonna do that. Berkey, you're not gonna do that. So it makes no sense for the Kraken, for him being on the Kraken, for him to be on a different team where he can be on their third line in a traditional checking line situation, help out on special teams, but get 10 to 14 minutes a night out there during the postseason. That makes infinitely more sense for him. Just as a player, that makes way more sense for him. So unless, again, he's going to Ron and he's saying, look, I do not want to be moved, I want to be in Seattle, blah, 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 I think you have to be open to it, because he's a fourth liner here in Seattle. And in some ways, especially come playoff time, he deserves better than that. And so that's where I'm at with him.
Right. And I think we're pretty much in agreement there. I think Francis should really be looking into that, though, if there is some interest there in Tanev to move him. And maybe there is, especially with a cup contender, might think you get 2 playoff runs with him, with another year left on his contract. We've seen the trade value that can add for certain players. Like Barclay Goodrow is a good example there, where, Tampa spends a first round pick to go acquire him. And yes, he's clearly in a bottom 6 role, but the contract is there. You get him for another year and it can make sense. And hey, they won a Stanley Cup.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just look at all the deals Tampa has done for these kinds of guys. Coleman, Goudreau, Tanner Jeannot. I mean, obviously a little more skilled there, but still, like, a lot of assets for guys to be in that middle to bottom 6, just to be pains in the butt come playoff time.
Yeah. Now, Dylan, one more question on Tanev, because the contract is a bit of an issue. 3.5 is kind of steep for a fourth liner, especially with another season left of commitment. Would you retain money on a Tanev deal?
Yeah, but this goes to a larger idea for me. Like, I if I'm the Kraken, there's nobody worth spending all of the cap space you're going to have next offseason on, and you still have a lot of players around. I would be totally fine retaining money for next year, because if I'm the Kraken, I'm sitting on money through most of next year anyway, waiting for somebody to become available via trade or whatever to go after. So I think you can afford to do that.
Yep, I was thinking the same thing. Heck, even retain half, and who knows what kind of return you could maybe get for a guy like that.
Yeah.
At the deadline with inflated prices, retaining half of that money.
Pitching 2 years. Yeah, 2 years of Brandon Tanev, 2 playoff runs of Brandon Tanev. You can maybe, try getting a first for that. If he's
I mean, Barclay Goodrow's your comp.
Yeah.
That's the trade comp right there.
Yeah. So it exists.
All right. So I think we've covered just about everybody who, in any way has a chance to be moved at the deadline. I guess, one more Chris. Well, we already kind of talked about Chris Drieger in the past. We think it's more important that the Firebirds kind of have that playoff run with him. We think it's better for Dreeks too, to get that showcase rather than being a backup or third string goalie at the NHL level. So I don't see him going anywhere before the deadline.
I don't either. And I don't, like I said, I don't think that it's one of those situations where it's worth just giving him away. Right? Like, would New Jersey give up a 6th round pick for him at 50% retained right now? Maybe, but why? Like, is that worth it really? Probably not. No, I think it's better off having him with the Firebirds, having the Firebirds go on another big run. They were so close last year. He's got them in a great spot again this year. I would certainly keep him there.
Yep, agreed. All right, so I think that covers kind of the small picture stuff, the very near term with the deadline. But of course, we have a conversation about the bigger picture, don't we?
Yes, we do. So one of the big things that had been talked about as the Kraken were losing games, as the playoffs were becoming increasingly less and less likely over the course of the last couple of weeks, one of the things that we've really seen pop up, whether it's in post-game live chats, whether it's been on Discord and Twitter, is the idea of is this core good enough? Is this the group that the Kraken can win with? Would their best case scenario be to kind of tear it down and do a complete rebuild, kind of try to start fresh, build around Maddie, build around Shane, try to get that star player that the Kraken kind of need via the draft, right? Go and be bad for a couple years, pick in the top 5, go out there and acquire a player like that. And we've seen a lot of this. You and I kind of pushed back on it, and I think that created some friction at times with some people. But look, I will start off and say, one, the Kraken, by what we talked about at the beginning of that segment, RJ, signaling they're not going to tear down next year, right? Otherwise, you would be looking at moving Yanni Gourde. You'd look at moving an Adam Larson with an extra year attached to him. Like, that would absolutely be on the table if this was a team looking at doing a rebuild. So I don't for a second believe that this team is going to do a complete teardown and rebuild. And there are many reasons why, which we can get into. But the first thing that I do want to say is, look, the way the NHL is set up right now, RJ, doing complete teardown and rebuilds and being bad for 3 to 5 years and picking high, it is the proven pathway to success, right? Like, that is, unfortunately, the best way to then build a good team. It's a painful process. It's a really sucky process. It's miserable for everybody involved, but it's the only thing in the salary cap world that has proven to be effective. It's the only thing that's been proven to be, I don't want to say sustainable, but the tried and true method that you can go out there and use to try to build a core that you can potentially go out and win a Stanley Cup with, right? I mean, there's really nothing else that's worked like it.
Right. I mean, you look at the teams that have had continued success that have won Stanley Cups, and the core of those teams almost every time comes from really high draft picks, usually multiple really high draft picks. There's only so many ways you can acquire players like that can get you over that mountain. And, unless you luck into a Jack Eichel trade, there's really not any other way to do it. So I understand the desire to maybe follow that path and do the painful rebuild, because I mean, history shows that it does tend to work.
Well, it works, and we'll get into how successful it can be later. I think we'll save that for last. But it's really this. It's the only thing that you can just do, right? Because until the PA and the players all kind of agree that, hey, maybe what's in the best interest for all of us is stop signing massive extensions that keep you with one mediocre franchise for your into your 30s. If all the players decided, you got a whole generation of players to decide that, yeah, we're just going to walk ourselves right to UFA, and then we'll just all be hitting the market at 26, 27, and we can go out there, then things change, right? Then there becomes other avenues. But the way things are right now, where you'll got guys signing for 8 years, re-upping at 8 years at the age of 25, they're just never on the market. So you have to draft them if you want them. So I want to start this off by saying, the people that are pushing for the Kraken to do this, you are not wrong. Like, that is the model. It absolutely is the model if you want to do that. The stuff that I think you and I were talking about, and why it doesn't make sense for the Kraken specifically right now, and certainly why I think Ron Francis and the Kraken, whether it's ownership, the rest of the front office, all of them aren't doing it, is because there's so many other factors that go into it beyond just the fact that the team's not going to be winning a ton for a little while. And I think right now, given the situation that the Kraken are in as a newer franchise, given some of the business situation around them, I think those are the things that we're going to talk about here. And the first thing that I want to talk about is, whenever the Kraken go that direction, if they go that direction, RJ, first thing that happens, Ron Francis isn't going to be in charge of it. I can't imagine ownership after what next year will be 4 years of Ron Francis doing what his plan was, and it not working and them having to kind of throw in the towel and go through a big rebuild, we generally don't see general managers survive that. Like I don't know if ever they decide, yeah, you know what? Okay, yes, what you just didn't work, but we trust you and we want you to then do it again, but hopefully this time it works. Like that doesn't happen.
No, you almost never see it. I mean, once the mandate is to be competitive and to have a playoff level team, which it has already been for Ron Francis, they've already gotten there. You just don't see GMs get a chance to rebuild. I mean, unless you've maybe won a Stanley Cup or two, and it's just then time to even then you usually don't see it.
No.
So yeah, I mean, that's the reality of it. If you go into an extended rebuild, Francis, Hackstall, the front office, they're not around anymore. They're not the ones doing it.
Right. And so that becomes the first like kind of question mark, because one of the aspects of why this would seem like a good idea for the Kraken, RJ, is because they've got such a great draft history. Right. So it makes you think that, hey, if the Kraken were to rebuild, they're generally really good at finding a lot of players. But if Ron Francis isn't the guy making the draft pick, and if his staff around him, all of the wonderful assistant general managers that he's built up in that front office around him, the heads of scouting, the scouting department, the analytics department that he has been very supportive of, and how he has them work with the scouting department to do everything that they do, that there's a very good chance that's not there if Ron Francis isn't there anymore. Right? Because Ron Francis might go get a different job. He takes some people with him. Those other people, this might become their opportunity to go somewhere else. You never know if, depending on how it happens, you can have ownership. And I'm not saying that the Kraken ownership would be this way, but we've seen it before where ownership goes, well, look, Ron Francis and this previous regime, they used a lot of analytics. It didn't work. We don't want to do that next time. We're not going to invest heavily in that. Right? Like, I don't know that would happen in Seattle, but it's something that could happen. Like, that would be on the table. And so it really worries me that you just have no idea who's going to be in charge and what kind of resources they would have and what resources they would listen to, who would be in charge of this rebuild. And so that's the kind of first red flag for me right now, is just that you can't use the previous successes of this front office when it comes to drafting or player acquisition and assume that continues under the next one, because you just can't.
Right. I mean, this does seem like kind of the perfect front office and group to navigate a rebuild if that's what you have to do. But you can't take any of that for granted that they're going to be there. For certain Francis isn't going to. And then, yeah, the analytics staff especially. When you talk about drafting, they've been behind a lot of their draft choices. I know, some of the people, in the analytics staff, like, I mean, one I think of right away is like Namita Nandakumar. Like, she's great on the amateur side of looking at draft prospects and who to target. And, she's going to have a lot of good opportunities too, especially if there's like turnover. I mean, she worked for the Philadelphia Eagles before this. There's always opportunities out there. You cannot guarantee that people like that are going to stay through a process like this.
Yeah, so there's that aspect of it that of course gives me pause about the idea of a rebuild, just because it's scary, and I like the setup that the Kraken have, and I don't want to see it go away if they decide to go in this direction, but I think it very much would if they decided to go in that direction. So you have that kind of front office side of things. You have no idea who the front office, head of front office is going to be, who the general manager will be, what kind of setup they're going to have, how big their scouting staff's going to be. I mean, that's something that can range from team to team. And one of the aspects of that also, factors into it, RJ, is team's going to be bad. Right? Like, that rebuilding teams are bad. We know this. Go look at the standings right now. You can tell me which ones are the rebuilding teams, because they're all the ones at the bottom. Like, that's the way it works. And one of the problems when your team is bad is that your revenue gets bad. And it's really tough on teams, and we historically see this too, RJ. When revenue gets bad, teams don't invest in things like big, large scouting staffs and big, large analytics departments and stuff, because the bottom line is being hurt by the fact that the team is bad and not as many people are going to watch it. And I think that's another thing that the Kraken need to worry about, is if this team rebuilds, RJ, they're working with thin margins from a fan perspective already. We've talked about this with the root viewership being very, very low. 13,000 people watching on television a game. You add that to the 17,000 that are in building, and you can say from like a, more than casual fan, there's about 31,000 Kraken fans. that are more than
Yeah,
casual.
it's not a lot.
It's not a lot. And if the team is going to be bad for a couple years, we've seen this everywhere else that a team goes bad and rebuilds. You're losing some of that, right? 5,000, 10,000, it varies, but you're going to lose several thousand of that small base that you're working with already. And that will affect revenue.
Right. And especially for a newer franchise. Look, if your franchise has history and has been established in the city for a long time and is a fixture, you can maybe afford to kind of deal with the ebbs and flows that come with that. But for the Kraken, especially kind of, being new to Seattle and, only in their third year, you need to be growing that number. That number is already abysmally small. You look at those TV numbers and those are really bad. You need to be growing that far beyond what it is. And if you go into an extended rebuild, I don't know how you could possibly do that.
No, and it worries me because you look at places like San Jose, RJ, right, that are rebuilding now. I mean, that was a building that our entire lifetimes watching hockey, that team was good and that building was full, right? And the city of San Jose rallied around the Sharks. They were, it was a Shark city. The Sharks owned that city, and they don't anymore. And you watch games like when the Kraken go to San Jose and it's maybe half filled lower bowl, if that. I mean, there are games where there's more empty seats than there are people in the building. And that's a building that sold out for 15, 18 years or something in a row. Every night. It just happens.
Streak, longer than a decade.
Yeah. It just happens. So it's one of those, that's the most uncomfortable part of all of this, I think, conversationally. Of this uncomfortable conversation, I think that's the most uncomfortable part. But there's just not a ton of Kraken fans. And some of them will go away if there is a rebuild, and that will have significant negative impacts on the team. Because you're going to have revenue go away, which will limit what ownership wants to do. It's going to be hard to win back fans. Also, this is where the NBA situation comes in. I know people don't like to think of it as something that will affect the team, but if you're halfway through that rebuild and you've lost another 5,000 fans and now the Sonics come in and they're competitive, or hey, they're just in a sport that's more popular, it becomes all the much harder to win people back over to the Kraken side of things once they start winning, because now you have another team in the building that plays at the same time of year, that probably is going to be better off the bat than the Kraken are and are at the time. And that's a problem. And right. It's going to make it even harder to get back some of those fans. So I think that's the biggest reason for me, RJ, is just looking at the fan base, looking at the financial situation of everything, looking at the potential of the NBA, all of that stuff. It's the biggest red flag of all of them for me when I look at the idea of the Kraken doing a rebuild, because I just don't know that they could survive it.
Right. And again, the people in charge, they're business people. They care about the team. They care about the city. They, of course, want the Kraken to succeed. But, they're business people first and foremost. This is a business. And it does worry me that you could have that dynamic potentially where you have the Sonics come back. The Kraken aren't competitive. And, if you're a business person, you're looking at, okay, where's your real moneymaker? And it's basketball. And, this dynamic, again, I'm not talking about the specific people involved in this situation. I'm just speaking right. Generally, when you have a couple investments, you have, say, an arena that you still need to pay off because you did a lot of this privately funded, where you look at, okay, where's the money coming in? And you spend your time, focus, and resources on the area that's your real moneymaker, and you kind of do the bare minimum for the area that's not. And I worry about, if they were to go and do a rebuild like that, that could become the dynamic. And it's just so hard to get out of, because the Sonics will never be not popular. Right. They'll never be unpopular in the city. Seattle will always love their basketball team as long as it's here. So you're always going to be dealing with that. And it's a bad dynamic to get into, and one that I don't know how you get out of.
Right. And we've seen it. And again, we're not saying that the Kraken ownership group would behave that way.
Right.
But that's traditionally how ownership groups behave, because we've seen this happen so many times before. And that's again, it's so scary, and it just becomes a death spiral situation that like you said is hard, if not impossible, to get out of in the long run. And it really, I just don't want to see that happen for the Kraken. I just don't. I just don't want to see it. So there's that aspect of it. The other thing is, because of the size of, the fan base and the potential hit that it would take, And this is, maybe a little bit more selfish on the selfish side of things, RJ, but a lot
Yeah.
of the stuff that exists around the Kraken would really take a hit and probably not survive. And that includes us and the media pool. Like all of the media outlets that the Kraken have, we know this, better than anybody. This stuff we can actually talk about, kind of. And that is, we're all operating on very thin margins covering this team, in part because it's a smaller fan base. It doesn't have the following of the Seahawks or the Mariners or, a bigger sport or even some other markets in the NHL. And so it makes it very difficult to cover the team, to put in, as much time as we put in to cover the team. And if that fan base gets smaller and then the margin gets slimmer or becomes non-existent, I think a lot of the media wouldn't be able to survive it. I don't know that we would be able to, just being completely honest. If the Kraken were to do that, it would be very, extremely difficult to do that on our end. And I think that would be true. And we see that in other places. Like, I hate to keep bringing up San Jose, but I think San Jose is the example right now because they are the rebuilding team that doesn't have, say Connor Bedard, right? Otherwise, Chicago would be in the same exact situation. But you look at San Jose, RJ, and they essentially have one reporter following that team from the big local paper, and that's it. That's all that can survive covering the Sharks because the fan base dried up so fast, right? And that's the way it is. You just have Shengpeng going around. That's it.
Yeah.
You watch.
By the way, he does excellent work.
He does great work. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But he's the only one there, right? They come to Seattle and you look, he's the only guy there that's traveling and following that team. You look at their media scrums and it's like him and then the TV person, right? Like the Piper Shaw equivalent. And that's it. That's the whole media group talking to the coach or talking to the players. Like it's not great. You know what I mean? It's not a great situation.
And I think it would be especially a shame in Seattle too, because we have such a great group of media covering the Seattle Kraken. I think that's one of the best things. And, again, maybe a little bit biased, but not even counting ourselves, right? Just looking around at all the other great people that cover this team. Like, I think there's something truly special there. And, if this were to happen and, again, everybody's operating on thin margins, I think you could see a lot of that talent just not be able to justify continuing to cover the team. And I think that'd be a shame because, there's really something special. Like up in that press bridge, there's so many great people who do such great work covering this team. I don't want to like mentioning specifically because there's so many names I could just rattle off through, take me 5 minutes at least. But that I would just hate to see that.
Yeah. And again, we're not even just talking about like independent institutions like us. Like this would affect everybody. This would affect the traditional, larger media groups. This would affect the TV side of things. Whoever the rights holder is going to be, right? Because we'd be talking about a timeline that goes past the Root Sports deal. And again, let's say whoever has the local television contract for the Kraken also picks up the Sonics. It becomes even more so the same situation that we talked about with ownership, right? Where one of those is going to gift you a lot more viewers, could be a lot more important to you. Where are you going to allocate your resources? It's more so going to be on the basketball side of things. So.
Yeah, and on the broadcast too. I know everybody enjoys the broadcast, and gosh, why not? Because it seems like Root spared no expense with their on-air talent. I mean, can you afford, a superstar John Forsland, a superstar Eddie Olczyk? Can you afford, JT Brown, Allison Lucan, Piper Shaw? all these great people that, they're going to have other options in the broadcasting world. I am certain, if they didn't want to. If Root didn't want to bring him back, that's another thing that you're risking. Can you have an A++ broadcast crew?
Right. And I think as you're in a situation where you need to be building the fan base as much as possible, I don't think you want to lose that. I don't think that it would be good for the Kraken to lose that. And that's again another really difficult part of it. And so those are like the big kind of red flags that I think about, just because we've seen it happen in other places, RJ, where, you have no assurances about what the next front office is going to be like, that things that have existed will continue. You have no assurances of what exists around the team, how much fan engagement there's going to be if there's fewer fans, right? Like all of those aspects. Already some of that's kind of taken a hit over these last couple seasons, right? It's not quite as much as we saw year one with the Kraken. So I think that's a worry. But let's say, RJ, the Kraken do it and stuff works out. You go through the expansion, the rebuild years, you get the high picks, you come across a great core group of players. You got Matty Beniers, Shane Wright, and two other guys, right? Maybe one's on the blue line, another forward, a guy on the wing with one of those two guys at center. And they're good players. You're talking point per game guy, playing on the wing, rock star stud defenseman who can play half the game every night, do all that good stuff. It still doesn't mean that you end up winning. And that's the other like dangerous aspect of that gives me pause about jumping right into this is there's only one team that lifts the Stanley Cup each year, right? There's only two teams that even get to the Cup final each year. Only one from the conference is going each year. And unfortunately, hockey is littered with incredible cores of players that didn't even get that far, right? Every year there's groups that can just be the best out there, or they're just so talented, they're so good, and all it takes is one guy getting injured during that playoff run, or one thing happening, or you just happen to run into another team that their core group is just that inch better than yours, and it doesn't matter. And you've done you go through that whole rebuild and all of that pain, and you come out the other side in, yes, a better situation than the Kraken are in now, because you'd be a playoff team every year. But at some point, then that becomes even worse almost, because you're there, you think you have a chance, and you still just struggle and you can't get there. And I think about the cores that Vancouver had all of those years with the Sedins and Kessler and all those guys and Luongo in net. And I think of the Sharks, RJ, who had that incredible group, and they made one Stanley Cup Finals appearance, and that was it, right? I think of just so many of those teams, the Ducks cores after they won, right? But in the Getzlaf years, those teams were fantastic. They made one Western Conference Final. Like there's just so many of these teams. I could go on forever talking about all of these teams that had these great cores. Look at the Leafs. You can't ask for a better core than having Matthews, Marner, and Nylander, right? And they've won
your dream scenario out of a rebuild. That's the
best case scenario. Best case scenario, you end up with a guy who can score 70 goals in a year and another guy who's guaranteed 100 points, and then Willie Nylander on top of it as a point per game guy. And they've won one playoff series. And so, again, it's just one of those things. All it takes is to have the wrong coach at the wrong time, who can't quite manage it all for you, right? Or like I said, an injury or whatever it is. You just had one bad free agent signing somewhere, and it's an anchor, and you can't survive it, and you can't get past it. Whatever it is, it just seems like it happens to so many good teams, and it's brutal. I could see that being Florida, right? Florida, incredible blue line, great players. Barkov, seminal piece you can build a franchise around. Entirely possible they never get back to another Stanley Cup final. That was it for them last year. Right? Like, We've seen it, and it's brutal. And so even when you do everything right, you can come out the other side and not see anything really for it at the end of the day. And that's the other aspect that I'm just like, I don't know that the Kraken need to rush into that right now, given those other red flags that we talked about.
Right. I mean, nothing is guaranteed. And even though you look backwards from a Stanley Cup win and look that just about every Stanley Cup win started with one of these rebuilds, but not every one of these rebuilds results in a Stanley Cup win. And that's kind of what it comes down to. And look, there are plenty of times where I will endorse that rebuild for sure. I mean, to bring up San Jose one more time, you look at where they're at right now, you could say 2 or 3 years ago, you need to go into that rebuild because you had two options if you're San Jose, because they had all these anchor contracts, huge contracts for players that weren't good, that went on forever. You have two options. You go for it, you avoid the rebuild, and you still miss the playoffs, or you embrace the rebuild, get really bad, have good high draft picks, and be able to rebuild and get those good players that you could potentially build for a cup run. That's not the choice the Kraken have. They could turn around next year and be competitive. This is not a team that, if they're going for it, they're going to miss the playoffs still. They have plenty of cap room to work with. They can make it, where especially if they sell off at this deadline, you turn those assets around and you could build a team that is almost certainly a playoff team next year. That talent does exist. So I think, you're not facing the choice of these teams that are just stuck in the middle forever. And you've continued to have prospects that come up, right? They have a good farm system. So I think it doesn't make sense for the Kraken in this time.
Right. And you continue to try to grow the fan base. Right, because that needs to be priority one for this team. And yes, obviously having great young players to root for, in addition to Matty Beniers and Shane Wright, would help in that. Having a team that is winning, and has a chance to go all the way every year would help in that. But I just think given right now and given the struggles the Kraken have faced through the first 3 seasons in doing so, I think the worst case scenario for them would be go full rebuild and lose all of the ground that they have worked really hard to build up. And I think that's something there. And I know, people can listen to this conversation and say, well, then what? They just aren't going to be like a competitive team, a team that's going to go and try to win Stanley Cups, whatever. There are examples of ways where you can try to do both. And I think that's what they need to try to do. I think of some teams that had really good groups of players, RJ, that weren't all high draft picks, and they were able to draft and develop cores while their team was also still kind of okay or good around them. I think of Nashville and that core group that they had back when they went to the Stanley Cup final, right? And you think about the players that really made that happen. Yes, there was like the PK Subbans and the Philip Forsbergs who came via, trades and free agency, that kind of stuff. But you also had a ton of players that were, homegrown prospects, but they weren't high draft picks, right? They went out and they found Pecorine. They went out and they found the blue line. And these were not high draft picked guys. I think Ryan Ellis was probably the highest draft pick. He was pick 11. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, and they managed to be a very dominant team for a long time. And they were able to build a very stable fan base in a non-traditional hockey market. Everybody in Nashville loves their Preds, right? They endeared themselves to that group, and they did it without having to do the total tear down rebuild. Yes, their expansion process was maybe a little bit more of doing that, but even still, those teams later on were not a direct result of that expansion process. Enough time had passed that you weren't looking at that. And so I think there are examples that the Kraken can follow where it's, look, just work on really nailing the draft picks that you have. Take advantage of years like this year where you can go ahead, try to draft as high as possible. You're going to get a good player, right? Sell off assets, get additional assets, all of that kind of stuff. Enter an offseason with cap space. If there's no superstar to spend it on, hold on to it. Make sure you can be a player when somebody runs into cap trouble or when somebody becomes unhappy with a team, right? And you can then be involved, try to fleece somebody and cultivate good players the way that you have. Maybe you end up on the right side of the next Philip Forsberg trade, right? Where you've got a veteran piece that somebody wants and you're able to get a prospect back that ends up blossoming into something good. I think you have a lot of avenues to that same level of contention without having to go through the significant pain and all of the potential problems that a rebuild would bring for a young franchise still looking to kind of find their footing in a very competitive sports market.
Yeah, I mean, well said. I mean, you kind of have to be smart and let the stuff come to you. And that's kind of what Nashville has done for a long time. And they've had a sustainable model. Like, look at them. They're going to probably make the playoffs this year. I can't believe it. But, even then, which is at the tail end of their, competitive run, they still look like a good and just competently managed team. So, I think there is that path for the Kraken to do that without any more. And look, you still have 2 top 5 picks. We don't know what Matty Beniers is going to become. There's a wide range of things. We don't know what Shane Wright's going to become.
Exactly.
We barely see him in the NHL. So it's not like they don't have any high draft picks to deal with either. I think it might feel very different at next season when you see maybe Matty Beniers take another step and when we see what Shane Wright can really do at the NHL level.
Yeah, I really don't think they're in as bad a shape as it seems. I don't think they need to go out and try to add 2 more top 5 picks to this group. I mean, they have such a solid group. They're going to have money available. They are a destination that guys want to come and play for, right? You're not going to have to worry about overspending on every free agent ever because you're trying to get them to, say, go to Calgary, where the weather's going to stink. They're going to have to be in a Canadian market. They're going to lose over half of their paycheck to taxes, right? Like, there's so many worse situations than Seattle that force you into some of these rough situations. But I think that there is a model that they can follow here, that they can have some success. I think they're going to have success, and I don't think they need to do a rebuild, and I really think a rebuild would do more harm than good for them. I just
Yep.
do. And that's why RJ and I have been so hesitant to get on board with that when so many people have brought it up, or when people want to talk about it or kind of go down that rabbit hole. It's a really fun rabbit hole. RJ and I, we spent our entire teenage years just doing that for teams, right? Whether it was in video games like
loved it.
Yes, like Eastside Hockey Manager, or just doing it like in notebooks and whatever, being like science lab classes, and we were doing this stuff, right? Like that's what we did. I absolutely love it. I totally love it as a former scout, as somebody who loves prospects, drafting, developing. It's so right up my alley. I just think looking at the bigger picture, it just doesn't work for the Kraken at this moment. And I think that this is one of those times, RJ, where, like we started off talking with Jordan Eberle, the fan base is a little bit more important than maybe the absolute best thing for the on ice product. And I think, just like with Eberle, that's where the idea of a rebuild is at as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there, Dylan. And hey, was that so bad? Uncomfortable conversation. There were definitely some uncomfortable moments.
Moments, yes. There's stuff
I feel like
that
we got
still
through it okay.
isn't great to talk about, but yeah, it's there. I think we got through it.
Yeah, well, I mean, because there was the scary part early on. There was definitely we painted a scary picture, but I think overall, coming around to the future is bright. I think there is a path that certainly would be preferable to take, and you have examples of teams that have had success that way. So I'm still a believer in the future of this team, and I'm doing okay. And I like the shots fired at Calgary as far as a destination there, with the Kraken playing the Flames today.
Oh, that's true. I didn't even think about that, actually. But, I'm just going based off of what every player has said ever. So,
Yeah. Winnipeg is too low-hanging fruit. So I admire you going with Calgary.
It is. Yeah, so that's where it's at. Of course, want to hear everybody's reactions to this. I'm sure we'll hear some stuff in the post-game tonight after that Calgary game, but want to see stuff in the comment section over on YouTube. Of course, tweet at us, all that kind of good stuff as well. Reminder about RJ's Armchair GM stream right after the trade deadline on Sunday the 10th at 7 over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. And of course, got to check out that Korean barbecue burger over at Queen Anne Beer Hall, their new burger of the month for March. You've still got plenty of the month to go take advantage of that. Maybe get it a couple times. So hope everybody enjoys that. Thanks to them for sponsoring this podcast as always, and we will see everybody next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons.
Absurdly Sane, Alaska Joe, Alex, Alvi, Andrew, Anonymous, Anthony, Beef, Ben, Brad, Bryce, Burnt Creme, Caden, Kat, Kaylin, Chandler, Charles, Shazzle Dazzle, Chip, Chris, Christian, Cody, Connor, Coop, Corey, Danny39, Denise, DJ Singletone, Duthin, Evie99, Eli, Elizabeth, Empty Net Hockey, Ethan, Evan, Fusion Mix, Gaby, Gabrielle, Gary, Gregory, Helena, Habak, Jane, Jessica, Joni, Joseph, Josh, Joshua, Julia, Justin, Katie, Kepler, Kitty B. Kraken, Cole,
L. Bell, Leanne, Levin, Light, Little Tennis Guy 8, Lonnie, Mac and Cheese, Maeve, Mark, Max, Maya, Michael, Michelle, Michigan Kraken, Nick, Night Drop, Noah, Nunya, Olivia, Paige, Patty, Paul, Rayanne, Randall, Rebecca, Robert, Rock Liquor, Ryan, Sarah, Scott, Sia Kraken, Sean, Sergey, Sergeant Pickles, Shannon, Skeletal Tendency, Steven, Striatic, Tasty Kobold, Team 114 Chris, Ty, Virginia, Wendy, Where the Slovakians At, and Zoe. Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.